Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that everyone you know believes you're a monster. The neighbors who waved hello now lock their doors when you pass, and the town that raised you wants you behind bars. Ray Harlan was a quiet man in a small Pennsylvania town, working at the hardware store and keeping to himself after his wife passed years ago. Then, a violent crime happened, and suddenly Ray became the only suspect. He had no alibi, no way to prove his innocence, and no time before they came for him. So Ray disappeared into the forest and built a shelter underground where no one would ever find him. He survived there for months, alone in the dark, waiting for the truth. But how long can an innocent man hide? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe. Tomorrow's story will stay with you. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, sat nestled in the Allegheny foothills, like a town that time had gently overlooked. Population 3,200, give or take a dozen, depending on the season and who was counting. The kind of place where people still knew their neighbors' names, where the hardware store extended credit on a handshake, and where Sunday morning church bells called folks to worship with a sound that echoed off the surrounding ridges. Ray Harlan had lived in Millbrook for all of his 45 years. Born in the small county hospital, raised in a modest house on Sycamore Street, married young at the Methodist Church on the square. His life had followed a simple, honest trajectory, the kind that didn't make for exciting stories, but made for a good man. He'd lost his wife Claire 7 years ago to cancer, ovarian, stage 4 by the time they caught it. She'd fought for 18 months with a grace that still took his breath away when he allowed himself to remember. After she passed, Ray had expected the grief to ease with time, the way people promised it would. It hadn't. Not really. He'd simply learned to carry it differently, the way a man learns to favor an old injury that never quite heals right. These days, Ray worked at Brennan's Hardware on Main Street, a position he'd held for nearly 2 decades. The store occupied a brick building that dated back to 1887, with creaking wood floors and the smell of machine oil and sawdust permanently embedded in the walls. Ray knew every inch of that place, every bin of screws sorted by size, every tool hanging on the pegboard walls, every customer's particular needs and preferences. Hugh Brennan, the owner, was 73 and had run the store since taking it over from his own father. He'd become something like a second father to Ray, especially after Claire died. Hugh had a weathered face that creased deeply when he smiled, which was often, and hands that bore the calluses of a lifetime of honest work. "You're here early again," Hugh would say most mornings, finding Ray already sweeping the front walkway or restocking shelves. "Don't you ever sleep in?" "Sleep's overrated," Ray would reply with a slight smile. The truth was, the empty house felt too quiet in the mornings. The hardware store, with its familiar smells and routines, felt more like home than his rental on Maple Street ever had without Claire in it. Ray's days followed a predictable pattern. He'd arrive at the store by 7, brew the first pot of coffee in the small back office, and unlock the front door at 7:30 sharp. Customers came and went, contractors picking up supplies, homeowners seeking advice on weekend projects, older folks just wanting someone to talk to for a while. Ray helped them all with the same patient attention, never rushing anyone, always taking time to explain things properly. Lunch usually meant a walk down to Gracie's Diner, 2 blocks south on Main. Gracie Holloway had been running the place for 30 years, serving breakfast all day and comfort food that reminded you of Sunday dinners at your grandmother's table. She was a round woman in her 60s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and a motherly manner that made everyone who walked through her door feel looked after. "Turkey club, wheat toast, no mayo." Gracie would call toward the kitchen before Ray even sat down. She'd known his order for years. Then she'd pour him coffee and sit across from him for a few minutes if business was slow, updating him on town gossip that he listened to politely but never participated in spreading. "You should get out more, Ray," she'd tell him regularly. "There's a whole world beyond that hardware store and that empty house of yours." "I get out plenty," he'd respond. "I'm here, aren't I? You know what I mean. You're still a young man. Claire wouldn't want you spending the rest of your life alone." Ray would nod, offering a non-committal sound of acknowledgement. He knew Gracie meant well. They all did. But the thought of trying to build something new with someone else felt like a betrayal of what he'd had with Claire, even after 7 years. After lunch, Ray would return to the store, working until closing time at 6. Hugh usually left around 4, trusting Ray to lock up. In the early evening, Ray would walk the quiet streets of Millbrook, a habit he'd developed after Claire died. The physical movement helped settle his mind, and he'd learned every street, every shortcut, every corner of his small town. He knew where Mrs. Patterson grew her prize roses, which stretched up their trellis like they were reaching for something just out of sight. He knew that the Kowalski family's porch light had a short in it that made it flicker on humid nights. He knew that old Mr. Chen fed the stray cats behind the Chinese restaurant every evening at 7:15, leaving out dishes of rice and fish scraps. Sundays meant church at the Methodist congregation where he and Claire had been married. He still sat in the same pew, 4th row from the front on the left side. People had stopped asking if he wanted to sit with their families. They'd learned he preferred his solitude, though he was always polite when they greeted him before and after services. Sheriff Walt Grimes usually caught Ray for a few words after church. Walt was 52, a lifelong Millbrook resident who'd known Ray since they were boys. They'd played Little League together, graduated high school the same year, stood up in each other's weddings. Walt had the solid build of a man who'd been athletic in his youth and was now fighting a slow, losing battle with middle age. His brown hair was more grey than not, and he wore glasses for reading that he was constantly misplacing. "You coming to the Autumn Festival next weekend?" Walt had asked just the previous Sunday. The town held one every October, with craft booths and apple cider and a small carnival for the kids. "Probably work the hardware store booth," Ray had replied. "Hugh always needs help." "That's work, not enjoying the festival. When's the last time you just did something for the fun of it?" Ray had considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "I enjoy my work. That counts, doesn't it?" Walt had shaken his head with affection. "You're a stubborn man, Ray Harlan. So I've been told." The conversation had been typical of their interactions, friendly, concerned, never pushing too hard. Walt understood grief in his own way. His wife had left him a decade ago, moved to Pittsburgh with a pharmaceutical sales representative. Different kind of loss, but loss all the same. Ray's house on Maple Street was a small 2-bedroom rental that he and Claire had moved into when they'd married. They'd planned to save up for something bigger, maybe with a yard for children to play in, but Claire's illness had drained their savings and then their dreams. After she died, Ray had thought about moving somewhere smaller, but the place held memories he wasn't ready to abandon. The house was simply furnished a worn couch in the living room, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, though he only ever used one, a bed that still felt too large for one person. Claire's things were mostly gone now, donated to charity in the first year after her death, but traces of her remained. A coffee mug she'd favoured still sat in the cabinet. A throw blanket she'd crocheted draped over the back of the couch. Photographs in simple frames on the bookshelf. Ray kept the place clean and orderly, a habit from his childhood and reinforced by life with Claire, who'd believed that a tidy home reflected a settled mind. He rose early, made his coffee, read the Millbrook Gazette over breakfast, and headed to work. Evenings were for reading. He favoured history and biographies, or watching the occasional baseball game on the small television in the living room. It was a quiet life, perhaps a lonely one by some measures, but it was his. Ray had no illusions about being special or remarkable. He was simply a man doing his best to move through his days with decency and purpose, honouring the memory of a woman he'd loved and carrying forward the values his parents had instilled in him. He was known in Millbrook as reliable, helpful, honest. If you needed advice on fixing a leaky faucet or building a shed, Ray Harlan was your man. If you needed someone to help move furniture or clear a fallen tree, Ray would show up with his truck and his tools. If you needed someone to listen without judgment, Ray would sit quietly and let you talk. The town knew him, trusted him, relied on him. And that was precisely why what happened next would cut so deep for Ray and for Millbrook both. Because when trust shatters in a small town, the pieces scatter far and wide, and some of them can never be gathered up again. The last Tuesday of October arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made people in Millbrook talk about perfect weather. The maples along Main Street blazed orange and red, their leaves drifting down to collect in the gutters. Ray had spent the day at the hardware store helping customers prepare for winter weather stripping, furnace filters, the first run on snow shovels, though it was still too early for snow in these parts. Hugh left at 4 as usual, reminding Ray to lock up properly. "Supposed to drop below freezing tonight," he said, pulling on his jacket. "First real cold snap of the season. I'll make sure the heat's set right before I leave," Ray assured him. The store stayed quiet through the last 2 hours. A few customers trickled in. Mrs. Patterson needed plant stakes for her chrysanthemums. Young Billy Thornton picked up sandpaper for a school project. Ray helped them both, made small talk, and watched the autumn sun sink lower through the front windows. At 6 o'clock sharp, he locked the front door, counted out the register, and left the deposit in the safe for Hugh to take to the bank in the morning. He set the thermostat to 55 degrees, checked that the back door was secure, and turned off all the lights except the security lamp in the rear storage area. The walk home took 15 minutes. Ray stopped at the small grocery on 4th Street for bread and eggs, exchanged pleasantries with the cashier, and continued on to Maple Street. His house sat dark and waiting, the way it always did. He let himself in, put away his groceries, and made a simple dinner of scrambled eggs and toast. The evening news played on the television while he ate at the kitchen table. National stories, mostly politics, weather systems moving across the country, a feature on harvest festivals in rural America. Ray half listened, his mind already planning tomorrow's work. They had a delivery coming in, boxes of winter supplies that would need unloading and shelving. He washed his dishes, set them in the rack to dry, and settled onto the couch with a book he'd been working through, a biography of Teddy Roosevelt. By 9:30, his eyes were growing heavy. He marked his place, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Ray had no idea that, 3 miles away, on the other side of Millbrook, Warren Finch was being found unconscious on his living room floor, blood pooled beneath his head, his home ransacked, and his safe standing open and empty. The next morning arrived with the shriek of sirens. Ray heard them while brewing his coffee, multiple vehicles racing through town with unusual urgency. Millbrook rarely had emergencies that required more than one patrol car. He stepped onto his small front porch, coffee mug in hand, and saw other neighbors doing the same, drawn outside by the commotion, faces concerned and curious. Something big must have happened, called Mrs. Chen from next door. She was 70, a widow who spent most days tending her garden and watching the neighborhood with keen interest. "Sounds like it's over near the north side," Ray observed, judging the direction of the fading sirens. He finished his coffee, showered, dressed, and headed to work. The hardware store sat on the southern end of Main Street, away from whatever emergency had stirred the town. Ray unlocked the front door at 7:30 as always, started the coffee maker, and began his morning routine. By 8 o'clock, the first customers arrived, but they weren't there to shop. They came to share news, the way people in small towns do when something shocking happens. "Did you hear?" asked Mrs. Patterson, slightly breathless from hurrying. "Warren Finch was attacked in his home last night, beaten unconscious. They took him to the hospital in Harrisburg." Ray felt his stomach tighten. "Is he going to be all right?" "They don't know yet. He was barely alive when they found him. Someone broke in, robbed him. They're saying maybe $50,000 taken from his home safe." Warren Finch was the senior loan officer at Millbrook Savings and Trust, a man in his early 50s who Ray knew mainly through church and the occasional encounter around town. He was quiet, professional, lived alone in a large house his parents had left him. Not someone you'd expect to keep that kind of cash at home. Throughout the morning, more details filtered in through customers and phone calls. The attack had happened sometime after 10 o'clock the previous evening. Warren's cleaning lady had found him when she arrived at 7 in the morning. The police were treating it as robbery and assault, possibly attempted murder depending on Warren's condition. Ray felt the way everyone did. Shocked. Violated. Crime like this didn't happen in Millbrook. They had the occasional drunk driving incident, some petty theft, domestic disputes that Sheriff Grimes handled with a mix of authority and neighborly mediation. But violence? Robbery of this scale? It felt like something from the news, not from their lives. Gracie's diner was packed at lunch, everyone discussing the attack. Ray found a seat at the counter, and Gracie poured his coffee with shaking hands. "I can't believe it," she said. "Warren Finch, such a quiet man. Who would do such a thing?" "Any word on his condition?" Ray asked. "Still unconscious, last I heard. They're calling it critical." The conversations around him buzzed with speculation. Maybe it was someone from out of town, someone who'd heard about the money. Maybe it was drug-related, though no one could imagine Warren Finch involved with drugs. Maybe it was random, which felt even more terrifying. Ray ate his lunch quickly and returned to the store. The afternoon dragged, his mind turning over the news. He'd lived in Millbrook his entire life and couldn't remember anything like this happening. The randomness of it disturbed him, the idea that violence could arrive without warning, shattering the ordinary rhythms of a Tuesday evening. At 4:30, Sheriff Walt Grimes walked through the door of the hardware store. Ray looked up from restocking a shelf of paint supplies. "Walt, terrible news about Warren." "It is." Walt's face was drawn, tired. He'd clearly been up all night. "Ray, I need to ask you some questions." Something in his tone made Ray's hands still. "Of course. Anything I can help with. Where were you last night? Between 9 and midnight?" The question landed like a stone in still water. "Home. I left here at 6, stopped at the grocery, went home." "Why? Anyone who can verify that?" "No. I live alone." "Walt, what's this about?" The sheriff pulled something from his pocket, a clear evidence bag. Inside was a compass, old and weathered, brass casing tarnished with age. Ray's heart dropped. "This was found at the scene," Walt said quietly. "At Warren Finch's house. The cleaning lady says you were at Warren's place about 3 weeks ago, fixing a sticky door. She remembers you had a compass on your key ring, said it seemed unusual, memorable. This matches her description." Ray's hand went automatically to his keyring. The compass wasn't there. He hadn't noticed it missing, hadn't thought about it in days. It had been Claire's gift to him years ago, something she'd found at an antique shop. He'd carried it more as a memento than for any practical purpose. "I don't understand," Ray said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "I lost that compass. I don't know when, maybe a week ago. I noticed it wasn't on my keys, but I figured it fell off somewhere. Ray, I need you to come down to the station and give a formal statement." "Of course. But Walt, you can't think I had anything to do with this." The sheriff's face was professionally neutral, but Ray saw something flicker in his eyes, doubt, uncertainty, the terrible space between friendship and duty. "I'm just gathering information. The compass puts you at the scene, and we need to eliminate possibilities. You understand." Ray did understand, but understanding didn't make it feel any less like the ground shifting beneath his feet. He locked up the store, left a note for Hugh, and rode in Walt's patrol car to the small police station on Elm Street. The questioning lasted 2 hours. Where exactly had he been? What time had he arrived home? Had anyone seen him? Did he have any reason to visit Warren Finch recently? Had they had any disagreements? Could he explain how his compass ended up at a crime scene? Ray answered everything truthfully, but his answers sounded thin even to himself. No alibi, no witnesses, no explanation for the compass beyond losing it somewhere, somehow, at some point in recent weeks. By the time Walt drove him back to his truck at the hardware store, the sun had set and the temperature had dropped. Ray sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine. Through the patrol car's windshield, he could see Walt on his phone, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. Ray drove home slowly, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He was a person of interest in a violent crime. His compass, Claire's compass, had been found at the scene of an attack that had nearly killed a man. He unlocked his front door and stood in the small entryway, suddenly seeing his home differently. Empty. Quiet. No one to vouch for him, no one to confirm his presence. The solitude he'd wrapped around himself like protection had become a liability. Ray slept poorly that night, waking often to stare at the dark ceiling. And when morning came, he discovered that suspicion in a small town spreads faster than fire. The change in Millbrook was immediate and absolute. Ray felt it the moment he walked into Gracie's diner Thursday morning. The usual hum of conversation dropped to near silence. Heads turned, eyes followed him to the counter. Gracie poured his coffee without her customary greeting, her hands moving mechanically, her gaze not quite meeting his. "Morning, Gracie," Ray said, trying to keep his voice normal. "Morning." The single word, clipped and distant. He sat at the counter as always, but the warmth that usually surrounded him had evaporated. The man seated 2 stools down Jerry Weeks, who Ray had helped repair a fence just last month, gathered his things and moved to a booth across the room. The message was clear. Ray forced down his breakfast, paid, and left without lingering. Outside, Mrs. Patterson was crossing the street. She saw him and immediately changed direction, suddenly needing to examine a window display she'd walked past twice daily for 20 years. At the hardware store, Hugh was already there, his face grave. "Ray, we need to talk." They sat in the back office, surrounded by filing cabinets and order forms and the familiar smell of paper and dust. Hugh looked older than his 73 years, the lines in his face deep with worry. "People are talking," Hugh said carefully. "About you. About Warren Finch." "I didn't do anything wrong." Ray kept his voice steady. "I lost that compass. Someone must have found it, or I don't know. But I didn't hurt Warren." "I believe you, son." "I do." Hugh's emphasis on the first word suggested not everyone shared his conviction. "But the town is scared. They want answers, and right now, you're the only answer they have." "What are you saying?" Hugh was quiet for a moment. "Maybe you should take some time off. Let this settle. Let the police do their work. When they clear you, everything will go back to normal." The suggestion felt like a blow. "You're asking me to stay away. I'm asking you to protect yourself. And maybe," Hugh hesitated, "maybe to let the store protect itself too. We've had 3 customers call this morning saying they'll shop elsewhere if you're working here." Ray stood slowly, feeling something crack inside his chest. "I understand, Ray. No, you're right. I'll stay away until this is resolved." He removed his store keys from his ring, setting them on Hugh's desk. The small act felt monumental, like severing a lifeline. He drove home in a daze. His phone began ringing that afternoon, Sheriff Grimes again, asking him to come back to the station for additional questions. They'd received new information, more inconsistencies to clarify. The second interview was harder than the first. A state police detective had joined them, a sharp-eyed woman named Kohler, who asked the same questions in different ways, circling back, probing for contradictions. Ray's story remained consistent because it was the truth, but he could see how weak it sounded. No alibi, a piece of evidence directly linking him to the crime scene. No clear explanation for how it got there. "Did you owe Warren Finch money?" Detective Kohler asked. "No. I barely knew the man." "Did he owe you money?" "No." "Have you experienced any financial difficulties recently?" "No. I live simply. I have what I need." "When was the last time you were inside Warren Finch's home?" 3 weeks ago. He had a door that was sticking. Hugh sent me over to fix it. The job took maybe 20 minutes. And you're certain you had your compass then? Ray closed his eyes, trying to remember. I think so. I don't check my keyring every day. I noticed it missing maybe a week ago, but I can't be sure exactly when I lost it. The detective made notes, her pen scratching against paper. Walt sat silent, his face unreadable. That evening, Ray stood at his kitchen window and watched his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, hurry inside when she saw him looking out. Her kitchen curtains twitched closed. Friday morning brought news that Warren Finch had regained consciousness. The whole town waited to hear if he could identify his attacker. Ray waited too, certain that Warren would clear him, that this nightmare would end. But Warren's statement changed everything. He couldn't identify his attacker, had been struck from behind, never saw a face. But he remembered hearing a voice, he said. A man's voice, deep and calm. And he remembered something else. The attacker had been tall, over 6 feet. Ray was 6'2". The description was vague enough to include half the men in Millbrook, but specific enough to not exclude Ray. And combined with the compass, it was damning. By Friday evening, Ray's phone had stopped ringing with questions and started ringing with silence, friends and acquaintances who'd promised to call and then didn't. Invitations that evaporated, a coldness that settled over his life like frost. He went to church Sunday morning out of habit and hope. Perhaps there, in the place where he and Claire had married, where he'd mourned her, where he'd sought solace for 7 years, perhaps there he'd find some support. The sanctuary filled slowly, families settling into their usual pews. Ray took his customary seat, 4th row from the front on the left. The pew remained empty around him. Families that usually crowded in beside him found spots elsewhere. Children were steered away by protective parents. Pastor Gaines delivered a sermon about judgment and mercy, about not casting the first stone. His eyes found Ray several times, and Ray understood the message was meant for him, meant for the whole congregation. But grace doesn't arrive on command, and forgiveness doesn't flow from fear. After the service, Ray stood on the church steps as people flowed around him like water around a stone. No one stopped to talk. Walt Grimes caught his eye from across the lawn and looked away quickly, getting into his patrol car. Ray walked home alone, understanding with cold clarity that his life in Millbrook had fundamentally changed. He was no longer Ray Harlan, the helpful man from the hardware store. He was Ray Harlan, the suspect, the possible attacker, the man who might have beaten Warren Finch nearly to death. Monday morning, he woke to find garbage scattered across his small front lawn, bags torn open, contents strewn like accusations. Someone had done this in the night, a message delivered in the coward's way. He cleaned it up silently, stuffing the mess into fresh bags, aware of curtains twitching in nearby windows. No one came out to help or ask questions. That afternoon, Sheriff Grimes appeared at his door, his face tight with an emotion Ray couldn't quite read. "Ray, I need you to come with me." "More questions?" "We've had some developments. Detective Kohler wants to speak with you again." At the station, they laid it out for him. Warren Finch's memory had improved. He now recalled more details, remembered that his attacker had smelled like sawdust and machine oil. Ray, who worked in a hardware store, who handled lumber and tools every day, fit that description perfectly. "This is circumstantial," Ray said, hearing the desperation creeping into his voice. "You're building a case on coincidences. A compass that belongs to you, found at the scene," Detective Kohler counted off on her fingers. "A physical description that matches. A scent memory that fits your occupation. No alibi for the time of the attack. You had access to Finch's home previously, knew the layout. I didn't do this." "Then who did, Mr. Harlan? Who would have your compass? Who else fits all these details?" Ray had no answer. The walls of the interview room seemed to press inward. They let him go, but with a warning. "Don't leave town. Don't attempt to contact Warren Finch. Make yourself available for further questioning." Ray drove home slowly, his hands tight on the steering wheel. In his rear-view mirror, he saw a patrol car following at a distance. They were watching him now, waiting for him to make a mistake, to reveal guilt through some action or attempt to flee. That night, Ray sat at his kitchen table with Claire's photograph in his hands. The image showed her in their backyard, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. She'd been wearing the blue dress she loved, her hair caught by a summer breeze. "I don't know what to do," he whispered to her image. "They think I'm a criminal. Everyone believes it." The photograph offered no answers, just her frozen smile, her captured joy from a time when the world made sense. Ray looked around his small kitchen, at the life he'd built from the ruins of grief, and understood with terrible clarity that it was about to be taken from him, not by truth, but by the appearance of truth. Not by justice, but by the machinery of justice, grinding forward on incomplete evidence and community fear. He had two choices: stay and watch them build a case against him, or run. Both felt impossible. Both felt like surrender. Tuesday morning arrived cold and grey, the first week of November bringing winter's warning. Ray woke before dawn from restless sleep, his mind churning through scenarios, all of them bad. He made coffee and sat in the darkness of his kitchen, watching the street lights blink off one by one as dawn approached. The decision had been forming in his mind for days, resisted and denied, but growing more solid with each suspicious look, each closed door, each whispered conversation that stopped when he approached. He couldn't prove his innocence from inside a jail cell, and that's where this was heading. He could see it in Detective Kohler's eyes, in the way Walt avoided looking at him directly, in the patrol car that now sat outside his house each night. They were building their case. And when they had enough, or thought they had enough, they would arrest him. Ray pulled out a duffel bag from the hall closet, one he and Claire had used for camping trips years ago. The fabric was faded, the zippers still worked. He packed methodically, thinking through what a man would need to survive in the woods. Sleeping bag, tarp, a change of clothes, his warmest jacket, the small camping stove they'd never gotten rid of. Matches in a waterproof container. From the kitchen, he took what he could carry: packages of dried food, granola bars, instant coffee, a metal pot for boiling water. He filled 2 water bottles and added them to the bag. His pocket knife, a small first aid kit, rope, the folding shovel from the garage. He stood in the living room as the sun rose, looking at the life he was about to leave behind. The photographs of Claire, the furniture they'd chosen together, the books he'd accumulated over 45 years. All of it would stay. All of it would become evidence of absence, proof of guilt in the eyes of those who'd already judged him. From the bedroom, he retrieved the one thing that mattered most: Claire's journal from their camping trips. She'd kept meticulous notes about the plants they'd found, the trails they'd hiked, tips for surviving in the wilderness. He'd kept it as a memorial, never imagining he'd need it for its original purpose. He wrapped it carefully in a plastic bag and placed it at the top of his duffel. Then he removed his wedding ring, studied it in the morning light, and placed it carefully in a small tin that once held mints. He buried the tin in the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a sock. If he was caught, he didn't want to lose it. At 6:30, before the street fully woke, Ray Harlan walked out of his house for the last time. He locked the door behind him, habit more than sense, and carried his duffel bag to his truck. The patrol car that had been watching his house was gone. Shift change, probably. He had a window, and he took it. He drove east, away from Main Street, away from the center of Millbrook. The forest lands began 3 miles outside town. Thousands of acres of state land that stretched into the mountains. Ray had hiked these woods as a boy with his father, had camped here with Claire in the early years of their marriage. He knew the trails, knew the terrain, knew where a man could disappear if he needed to. 2 miles down the old logging road, Ray parked his truck at a pull-off used by hunters and hikers. He removed the license plates and hid them under the seat. The truck would be found eventually, but it might buy him time. He shouldered the duffel bag, took one last look at the vehicle that had served him faithfully for 8 years, and walked into the forest. The morning was cold, his breath visible in the air. Dead leaves crunched under his boots. Above him the canopy stretched bare-limbed against the grey sky, most trees already stripped by autumn winds. Ray followed a trail he remembered from childhood, one that led deeper into the state forest, away from the commonly used paths. After an hour of walking, his shoulders aching from the weight of the bag, he stopped to rest. The sounds of civilization had faded. No cars, no voices, just the whisper of wind through branches and the occasional call of a crow. Ray pulled out Claire's journal and opened it to the first page. Her handwriting, neat and careful, offered instructions like a gift across time. He read her notes about finding water sources, identifying edible plants, building shelter. She'd been the practical one, the planner. He'd been the dreamer, content to follow her lead. "I need you now," he whispered to the pages. "I need your wisdom." He continued walking, moving off the trail now, following game paths and instinct. The ancient oak tree stood where he remembered it, a giant that must have been old when his grandfather was young. Its trunk was 6 feet across, gnarled and massive. The root system spread out like the fingers of a buried hand, creating hollows and spaces beneath. Ray circled the tree, examining the ground. One section, on the north side, showed a natural depression where roots had created an overhang. It wasn't much, but it was possibility. He set down his bag and pulled out the folding shovel. The first hours of digging were the hardest. The ground was cold but not yet frozen, packed with rocks and roots that fought his efforts. He cleared the depression, going deeper, widening the space. His hands blistered quickly, then the blisters broke and bled. He wrapped them in strips torn from an old t-shirt and kept digging. By afternoon, he had created a hollow roughly 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He stretched the tarp across the opening, securing it with rocks and fallen branches, then covered it with leaves and debris. From 20 feet away, it was nearly invisible. Ray crawled inside and sat in the dimness, his back against the cold earth, his body aching from work. This was his home now. This hole in the ground beneath an ancient tree. This was what innocence looked like when the world decided otherwise. He thought of his house on Maple Street, probably being searched by now. Sheriff Grimes would have found him gone, would have called for backup. They'd be looking for him, and his disappearance would confirm every suspicion, validate every doubt. Running made him look guilty, but staying would have put him in a cell, and guilt or innocence seemed to matter less than the story people wanted to believe. Ray pulled out a granola bar and forced himself to eat half, saving the rest. Resources had to last. He didn't know how long he'd need to stay hidden. Days, weeks, until someone found the real attacker, until evidence emerged that proved his innocence. He had no answers, only this. He was alive, free, and still fighting, even if the fight meant hiding in the earth like an animal. As darkness fell, Ray heard the distant sound of dogs baying. Search teams already looking for him. The sound sent ice through his veins. He sat motionless in his shelter, hardly breathing, listening to the sounds grow closer then fade away. They were searching the trails, the obvious places. They hadn't found him yet. That night, lying on the hard ground with his sleeping bag pulled tight against the cold, Ray stared up at the tarp, inches above his face, and wondered what he'd become. A fugitive. A man suspected of violence, someone his neighbors now feared. He thought of Claire, of what she would say if she could see him now. Would she understand? Would she tell him he was brave or foolish? Would she hold him and promise everything would work out the way she had during her illness when they both knew it wouldn't? "I'm sorry," he whispered into the darkness. "I'm sorry for all of this." The earth held no comfort, offered no answers, but it held him, at least. It gave him space to survive one more day, and then another. And perhaps that was enough. Above ground, Millbrook was learning that Ray Harlan had disappeared. The manhunt was beginning, and a town's certainty of his guilt was hardening into something that would be difficult to ever undo. But Ray, in his hole beneath the oak, was beyond their reach, for now. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that dropped below freezing most nights and a cold that settled into Ray's bones like an unwelcome guest. He'd been underground for a month, and the shelter that had seemed barely adequate in November now felt dangerously insufficient. Ray had learned to move like a ghost through the forest. He emerged only at dawn and dusk, when the light was too uncertain for searchers to trust their eyes. He'd expanded his shelter, going deeper into the earth, reinforcing the walls with branches and rocks. The space was now almost 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide, enough to sit up in, enough to move without constant hunching. He'd created a ventilation system using hollow reeds that extended to the surface, disguised among the natural growth around the oak's base. Air flowed in, barely but enough. Carbon dioxide escaped. It was primitive but functional, the kind of solution that would have made Claire proud of his ingenuity. The insulation came from nature itself. Ray packed the walls with moss, stripped carefully from trees, leaving enough that the forest wouldn't show obvious signs of harvesting. He layered pine needles against the tarp ceiling, then more leaves, then dirt. The shelter held heat better now, though heat was a relative term when the outside temperature hovered in the 20s. Water was his greatest challenge. The creek that ran a quarter-mile from his shelter had been his lifeline, but now ice formed along its edges. Each morning before dawn, Ray made the careful journey to the water, carrying his bottles and the dented tin cup he'd found buried near the oak. The cup had become precious to him, a connection to someone else who'd sought refuge in these woods, someone who'd survived. He'd break the ice with a rock, fill his containers, and hurry back before light exposed him. The water was so cold it hurt his teeth, but it kept him alive. Food was scarce. The granola bars and dried goods from his initial pack had run out within 2 weeks. Since then, Ray had survived on what the forest provided. He'd set snares using wire salvaged from his camping supplies, catching rabbits and squirrels. The first time he'd killed a rabbit, he'd wept while preparing it, thanking the animal for its life, feeling the weight of taking something living to preserve himself. Claire's journal had saved him repeatedly. Her notes on edible plants, written in those long-ago camping trips, became his survival guide. He found wild onions, dug up Jerusalem artichokes, stripped bark from certain trees to access the cambium layer beneath, surprisingly nutritious if you could get past the texture. He cached supplies in multiple locations, paranoid about discovery. Small stashes of food, dry clothes, matches, spread throughout his territory. If his main shelter was found, he'd have fallback positions. His body had transformed. The 40 pounds he'd carried as comfortable middle-aged weight had melted away. His face was gaunt, his ribs visible, his arms lean and corded with muscle from constant labor. His beard had grown wild, and his hair hung past his collar. He'd caught his reflection once in the still surface of the creek and barely recognized himself. The mental challenge was harder than the physical one. Loneliness pressed in like the cold, constant and numbing. Ray talked to himself to maintain sanity, reciting poems he'd memorized in school, repeating conversations with Claire from memory, narrating his actions like a teacher explaining to a student. "Now we're going to check the eastern snare," he'd whisper, approaching carefully, watching for tracks. "Remember to move with the wind, stay low." Some nights, when the darkness in his shelter felt absolute and suffocating, he'd light one precious candle stub and read from Claire's journal. Her words comforted him, observations about the beauty of frost on spider webs, notes about the call of a particular bird, love notes, written to him in the margins. "Ray, my love." One note read, "You worry too much. Trust yourself. You're stronger than you know." He'd needed that strength. He needed it still. Back in Millbrook, life continued without him. Ray had no way of knowing this, but the search had scaled back after the first 2 weeks. The initial urgency helicopters, search dogs, teams combing the trails, had faded when no trace of him emerged. Sheriff Grimes had led those early efforts with grim determination, torn between his duty and his growing doubt. The hardware store remained closed on Tuesdays, the day Ray used to work late. Hugh Brennan had hired someone new, a younger man from the next county who knew tools but didn't know the community the way Ray had. Customers complained about the change but shopped there anyway. Life moved on. Gracie's diner still served turkey clubs on wheat toast, but no one ordered them without mayo anymore. She'd removed the meal from her regular rotation, unable to make it without thinking of Ray and wondering where he was, whether he was alive or dead, guilty or innocent. Warren Finch had recovered fully and returned to his position at the bank. He walked with a slight limp now, a lingering effect of the attack, and seemed more nervous than before, jumping at sudden sounds. He told people he couldn't remember much about that night, that trauma had blanked his memory. But he remembered enough to keep Ray Harlan's name at the center of suspicion. At the sheriff's department, Deputy Frank Cullen had been reviewing the case file during slow shifts. Something bothered him about the evidence, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. The compass seemed too convenient, too perfectly placed. The timeline felt slightly off. Warren Finch's description was vague enough to fit dozens of men, yet the investigation had focused entirely on Ray Harlan. Cullen kept his thoughts to himself, knowing that questioning the case would mark him as disloyal, as someone who couldn't be trusted. But he couldn't stop turning it over in his mind. In the forest, Ray had no knowledge of these developments. He existed in a bubble of immediate survival, his world narrowed to the next meal, the next water run, the next night survived. The first major winter storm arrived in mid-December. Ray had felt it coming, the pressure change, the way animals grew quiet and scarce, the particular smell of snow in the air. He'd prepared as much as possible, gathering extra wood for potential fire, securing his shelter's covering, filling every container with water. The snow began at dusk and didn't stop for 36 hours. Ray huddled in his shelter as the temperature plummeted. He could hear the wind howling through the forest, hear branches cracking under the weight of accumulating snow. The earth around him pressed close, tons of it, and for the first time since entering the shelter, he felt true claustrophobia. What if the weight caused collapse? What if he was buried alive, suffocated slowly in his hiding place? What if the ventilation system clogged with snow? Ray forced himself to breathe slowly, to talk himself through the panic. The roots are strong. The earth has been here for thousands of years. It's not collapsing now. Breathe. Just breathe. He survived the storm by retreating into memory. He remembered every camping trip with Claire, every trail they'd hiked, every night under stars. He remembered her laugh, the way she'd squeeze his hand when thunder scared her, how she'd make terrible coffee over a camp stove and insist it tasted perfect. When the storm finally passed, Ray emerged to a world transformed. Snow had buried everything under 2 feet of white silence. His tracks from previous days were erased. The forest was pristine, beautiful, and more dangerous than ever. He stood beside the ancient oak, looking at the landscape, and felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly, but a grim determination. He'd survived a month. He'd survived this storm. He could survive whatever came next. Ray found the tin cup frozen in a snowdrift. He dug it out, held it in his cold hands, and thought of the person who'd left it here decades ago. They'd survived too. They'd made it through. One more day, Ray whispered to the cup, to himself, to the memory of Claire. Just one more day. January brought a cold so severe that Ray sometimes wondered if he'd simply freeze one night and not wake up. The thought wasn't frightening anymore, just factual one. More possibility in a life reduced to possibilities and probabilities. He'd been underground for nearly 3 months. Time had become fluid, measured not by calendars, but by the rhythm of survival. Wake before dawn, check snares, collect water, return to shelter before full light, wait through the day, emerge at dusk, forage what little the frozen forest offered, return to darkness. The hunger was constant now. Ray had lost count of the pounds he'd shed, but his clothes hung loose on his frame, cinched tight with rope to keep them from falling off. His body had become efficient, burning energy carefully, moving with the economy of someone who understood that every calorie mattered. He'd trapped a rabbit 2 days ago, his first protein in a week. The animal had died quickly in the snare, and Ray had thanked it as he always did, a ritual that felt necessary to maintain some sense of humanity. He'd stretched the meat over 3 days, cooking small portions over a carefully concealed fire that he allowed himself only when desperation outweighed caution. The spiritual reflection that had begun in November had deepened into something profound. Alone in his shelter, with nothing but the earth and his thoughts, Ray found himself questioning everything he'd believed about justice, about fairness, about the nature of truth itself. He thought often about the Bible verses he'd heard all his life in church. The truth will set you free. But what did freedom mean when the truth was trapped underground with him, when no one above was listening, when his very existence had become a kind of living death? Each night, Ray pulled out Claire's photograph, now creased and worn from handling. He'd wrapped it in plastic salvaged from food packaging, protecting it as best he could from moisture and cold. Her face, frozen in that moment of joy, reminded him of what love looked like, what it meant to be known and cherished. "Would you understand this?" he'd whisper to her image. "Would you think I'm brave, or just a coward running from judgment?" The photograph offered no answers, but studying her face calmed something in him. She'd faced death with such grace during her illness, never complaining, never raging at the unfairness. She'd simply lived each day as fully as she could until she couldn't anymore. "I'm trying to do the same," Ray told her. "I'm trying to live." Back in Millbrook, Deputy Frank Cullen had continued his quiet investigation. It had started as curiosity, an itch he couldn't stop scratching, but had become something more deliberate. He'd spent his off hours reviewing every piece of evidence, every statement, every detail of the case against Ray Harlan. The security footage from the gas station near the bank had bothered him from the beginning. The timestamp showed someone passing by around the time of the attack, a figure caught in the edge of the frame. The person was tall, yes, but the build seemed different from Ray's. Leaner, perhaps. The footage was grainy, inconclusive, but it existed. Cullen had pulled the footage again, studied it frame by frame on his home computer. He'd measured the figure against known reference points, compared it to Ray's driver's license photo. The proportions weren't quite right. He'd brought his findings to Sheriff Grimes one afternoon in early January, laying out the images on the sheriff's desk with careful precision. "Walt, look at this. The shoulder width, the gait. I don't think this is Ray Harlan." Grimes had studied the images, his face troubled. "It's not conclusive, Frank. Could be anyone." "That's my point. It could be anyone. But we stopped looking when Ray ran. What if we got it wrong?" The sheriff had been quiet for a long moment. His compass was at the scene. He had no alibi. He fled. Those aren't the actions of an innocent man. Or they're the actions of a scared man who knew no one would believe him, Cullen countered. The conversation had ended without resolution, but Grimes had kept the images. That night, alone in his office, he'd looked at them again and felt the first real stirrings of doubt. Meanwhile, the annual audit of Millbrook Savings and Trust had revealed irregularities. The bank's accountant, a thorough woman named Patricia Drummond, had noticed discrepancies in several accounts. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger immediate alarm, but consistent over time. She'd flagged them for review and notified the bank's board. Warren Finch, as senior loan officer, was asked to explain the irregularities. He'd attributed them to clerical errors, system glitches, the normal complications of small-town banking. His explanations were plausible enough that the board had accepted them, at least initially. But Patricia Drummond was not satisfied. She'd worked in banking for 30 years and knew the difference between errors and intentional manipulation. She'd quietly continued her review, documenting what she found, not yet sure what it meant, but certain it meant something. In the frozen forest, Ray knew none of this. He existed in his own universe of survival, unaware that threads were being pulled in the world above that might eventually unravel the case against him. His darkest moment came on a night in mid-January, when the temperature dropped to 8 degrees. Ray huddled in his sleeping bag, wearing every piece of clothing he had, and still the cold penetrated. His water had frozen solid, his fingers and toes ached with the beginning of frostbite. The shelter, which had seemed adequate in November, felt like a tomb. He'd contemplated surrender that night, simply walking back to Millbrook, turning himself in, accepting whatever judgment came. At least he'd be warm. At least he'd have food. At least the uncertainty would end. He pulled out Claire's photograph with numb fingers, studied it in the dim light of a precious candle stub. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "I'm dying out here. And for what? For pride? For principle? They've already decided I'm guilty." He thought of his trial, of standing before Judge Harrington while witnesses testified about his suspicious behavior, his lack of alibi, his convenient disappearance. He thought of the jury people he'd known his whole life looking at him with conviction rather than compassion. Then he thought of something else. He thought of giving up, of letting the lie become truth, of spending years in prison for something he didn't do. He thought of Warren Finch, whoever had really attacked him, walking free because Ray's guilt was convenient. "She never gave up," Ray said aloud, looking at Claire's smile. "Even when the cancer was winning, even when she knew how it would end, she never gave up fighting." The memory of her strength, her dignity in the face of certain death, pulled him back from the edge. If Claire could face down mortality with grace, he could survive another night in the cold. Ray carefully wrapped the photograph, tucked it away, and blew out the candle. He pulled the sleeping bag tight around him and closed his eyes. "One more day," he whispered. "Just one more day." Outside, the temperature continued to drop. Inside, beneath the ancient oak, Ray Harlan held on. The cold snap lasted 4 days. Ray survived on willpower and the small cache of frozen berries he'd discovered, stored by squirrels in a hollow tree. He'd felt guilty taking them, knowing the squirrels would suffer, but survival had taught him that guilt was a luxury he couldn't afford. When the weather finally broke, Ray emerged weak but alive. The sun, pale and distant, felt like a gift. He stood beside the oak tree, his body trembling with exhaustion, and made himself a promise. "I am innocent," he said to the forest, to the sky, to whatever was listening. "Truth matters, even if I'm the only one who knows it. I will survive. I will live. And someday, somehow, the truth will come out." It was a promise made with no evidence to support it, no reason to believe it. But it was enough to keep him breathing, keep him moving, keep him fighting through one more frozen night. Late January brought a thaw that felt like mercy. The temperatures climbed into the 40s, and water dripped from branches like the forest itself was weeping with relief. Ray emerged from his shelter more often, his body slowly recovering from the brutal cold snap, though recovery was relative when you were still living in a hole in the ground. He had no way of knowing that in Millbrook the careful structure of lies that had sent him into exile was beginning to crack. Patricia Drummond sat in her home office on a Thursday evening, surrounded by printouts of bank records. She'd been reviewing them for weeks now, and the pattern was undeniable. Over 18 months, $47,000 had been systematically moved from various accounts, the transactions disguised as legitimate transfers, loan payments, or administrative adjustments. The accounts affected were primarily those belonging to Warren Finch himself, his personal savings, his retirement fund, even a trust his parents had established. Someone with access and knowledge had been stealing from Warren Finch, and the only person with that level of access was Warren Finch himself. Patricia picked up her phone and called Sheriff Grimes. "Walt, I need to speak with you about the bank audit. Privately, and soon." The meeting happened Friday morning in a small conference room at the sheriff's department. Patricia laid out her findings with the precision of someone who'd spent a career dealing with numbers and their truths. $47,000, she said, sliding the documentation across the table. Embezzled over 18 months. The transactions were sophisticated enough to avoid immediate detection, but not sophisticated enough to survive thorough audit. Sheriff Grimes studied the papers, his face growing graver with each page. Warren was stealing from himself. Warren was covering his tracks. These accounts were his, but the money went elsewhere. I haven't traced the final destinations yet, but I have suspicions. Gambling debts would be my guess. Deputy Cullen, who'd been invited to the meeting, leaned forward. So the robbery might not have been a robbery at all, Grimes finished quietly. Patricia nodded. Or if it was staged to cover the embezzlement. Someone discovers you've been stealing, confronts you, and suddenly you need a different story. A violent robbery explains missing money and shifts blame away from your own actions. Cullen stood and walked to the window, his mind racing. The compass. Ray Harlan's compass at the scene. How does that fit? That's your job to figure out, Patricia said. I'm just telling you the financial evidence doesn't support the story we've been told. After Patricia left, Grimes and Cullen sat in silence, the weight of implication heavy between them. We need to re-interview Finch, Cullen said finally, and we need to do it carefully. They brought Warren Finch in that afternoon, framing it as a follow-up interview, routine questions about his recovery. Warren arrived looking nervous, his hands fidgeting with his car keys. The interview started gently. How was he feeling? Any lingering effects from the attack? Had he remembered any additional details? Then Grimes shifted direction. Warren, we've been reviewing the bank's financial records as part of the investigation. Can you explain some irregularities we've noticed in your accounts? The color drained from Warren's face. What kind of irregularities? Transfers, withdrawals, movements of money that don't quite add up. Grimes kept his voice neutral, professional. Can you walk us through them? Warren stammered explanations, errors, corrections, complicated transactions he couldn't quite recall. His answers grew more tangled, more defensive. Were you gambling, Warren? Cullen asked, quietly. The question landed like a stone. Warren's mouth opened, closed. That's not relevant to the robbery. Isn't it? $47,000 missing from your accounts, then suddenly a violent robbery that supposedly took $50,000. That's quite a coincidence. I was attacked. You saw the evidence. You found the compass. Ray Harlan's compass, Grimes interrupted. Tell me about that, Warren. When did you last see Ray before the attack? I don't know. Weeks before. He fixed my door. And you're certain you didn't see him the night you were attacked? I told you, I was hit from behind. I didn't see anyone clearly. The interview continued for 2 hours, Warren's story developing small inconsistencies, his confidence crumbling. They let him go but requested he remain available for further questions. That evening, Grimes authorized a search warrant for Warren Finch's home. They executed it Saturday morning with a team of deputies and a forensic specialist from the state police. In Warren's study, in a locked desk drawer, they found a burner phone. The phone's call history had been deleted, but the forensic specialist was able to recover fragments of text messages. The messages painted a damning picture, a conversation between Warren and someone named Cy about handling the problem and making it look real. One message stood out. Got the item. HH won't know what hit him. H, Cullen said, studying the text. Harlan's initials are RH, not HH. Could be a mistake, Grimes said. Or maybe he pulled out his notebook, flipping through pages of interview notes. Cyrus Maddox. He does odd jobs around town. Handyman work. People call him Cy. Within an hour, they'd located Cyrus Maddox at his small rental house on the south side of Millbrook. A search of his property revealed a lockbox containing $3,000 in cash and a receipt from a pawn shop in Harrisburg for a compass matching the description of Ray Harlan's. Cyrus Maddox was a lean man in his mid-30s, with a face that suggested hard living and poor choices. Under interrogation, he lasted 45 minutes before breaking. The story tumbled out in fragments of guilt and justification. Warren Finch had owed money to people in Harrisburg, serious people who didn't accept excuses. He'd been embezzling from the bank to cover his gambling debts but couldn't keep up. When the audit was announced, Warren had panicked. He'd approached Cyrus with a plan: stage a robbery that would explain the missing money and deflect suspicion. But they needed a scapegoat, someone without an alibi, someone easy to blame. Ray Harlan had been the perfect target. A loner, a widower, no close family to defend him. Cyrus had stolen Ray's compass weeks earlier, taking it from Ray's truck when it was parked outside the hardware store. The theft had been so simple Ray hadn't even noticed. The attack on Warren had been staged. Cyrus had hit him, carefully, enough to cause injury, but not serious harm. They'd made it look like a struggle. They'd planted the compass. They'd called 911 and let the investigation follow its predictable course. "We figured he'd get arrested, maybe do a few years," Cyrus said, his voice hollow. "We didn't think he'd run. When he disappeared, Warren said it was even better. Made him look guilty. Made everyone forget about the money." Sheriff Grimes sat across from Cyrus, his face a mask of controlled fury. "An innocent man has been living in the woods for 3 months because of you. In winter, he could be dead." "I know," Cyrus whispered. "I know." Warren Finch was arrested at his home that evening. He protested, claimed Cyrus was lying, but the evidence was overwhelming. The burner phone, the text messages, Cyrus's detailed confession, the financial records showing systematic embezzlement. The story broke across Millbrook like thunder. Within hours, everyone knew Ray Harlan was innocent. He'd been framed, blamed for a crime that was barely a crime, driven into hiding by a conspiracy of desperation and greed. The town erupted in shock and shame. At Gracie's diner, people sat in stunned silence. At the hardware store, Hugh Brennan wept openly, his head in his hands. At the Methodist church, Pastor Gaines called an emergency prayer service. But the most urgent question remained: where was Ray Harlan? Was he alive? Could he possibly have survived 3 months in the forest through one of the coldest winters in recent memory? Sheriff Grimes stood in his office, looking at the map of state forest lands on his wall. Thousands of acres of wilderness, hundreds of places a man could hide or die. "Find him," Grimes said to his assembled deputies. "I don't care how long it takes. We find Ray Harlan and we bring him home." The search began at first light. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire on a dry summer day, but its heat couldn't reach the man it concerned most. Ray Harlan remained underground, unaware that his name had been cleared, that Warren Finch and Cyrus Maddox sat in county jail cells, that the entire town now knew the truth. By Sunday morning, the story had reached regional news outlets. Television crews arrived in Millbrook, setting up on Main Street, interviewing residents about the wrongly accused man who'd vanished into the wilderness. The footage showed a small town grappling with collective guilt, people who'd turned their backs on a neighbor now desperate to make amends. Gracie Holloway stood before the cameras, her eyes red from crying. "Ray, if you can hear this somehow, if someone finds you and tells you we know the truth now, we know you're innocent, please come home. We're so sorry. Please just come home." Hugh Brennan offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to Ray's safe return. "That man is like a son to me," he told reporters, his voice breaking. "I should have defended him stronger. I should have believed in him. If he's out there, if he's alive, we need to find him." The search operation, launched Sunday afternoon, was massive by small-town standards. Sheriff Grimes coordinated with state police, Forest Service rangers, and volunteer search and rescue teams from 3 counties. Helicopters, equipped with thermal imaging cameras, flew grid patterns over the state forest. Ground teams on snowshoes fanned out along trails and logging roads. They found Ray's truck on the second day, hidden off an old logging road with its plates removed. The discovery confirmed he'd gone into the forest, but the trail ended there. 3 months of weather, snow, and wind had erased any tracks he might have left. In his shelter beneath the ancient oak, Ray heard the helicopters. The sound was different from the initial searches back in November, more persistent, more organized. He pressed himself deep into his earthen refuge, hardly breathing, certain they'd intensified their manhunt, that his time was running out. He didn't know they were trying to save him, not arrest him. On the third day of searching, Ray heard voices closer than ever before. He'd been preparing to make a water run when the sounds of people moving through the forest froze him in place. He crawled back into his shelter and waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the ventilation system, he heard fragments of conversation carried on the wind. Need to find him. Innocent. Bring him home safe. Ray's mind struggled to process what he was hearing. Innocent. Home? The words didn't fit the narrative he'd been living with for 3 months. He dismissed it as wishful thinking, his brain creating hope where none existed. But over the next 2 days, he heard more. Search teams passed close enough that their radio chatter reached him clearly. Command, this is Team 3. No sign of Harlan in Sector 7. Moving to Sector 8. Copy that, Team 3. Remember, we're looking for a survivor, not a suspect. Approach with care if you make contact. A survivor, not a suspect. Ray's hands trembled as he listened. Something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the world above while he'd been buried in the earth below. On Thursday, a week after the search began, Ray made a decision. He needed to know what was happening. He needed information, even if gathering it meant risk. That night, after dark, he moved closer to the forest road where search teams had been staging. He crept through the underbrush, silent as a shadow, until he was close enough to see their vehicles, their equipment, their faces illuminated by portable lights. Someone had left a radio playing a local news station. Ray positioned himself within earshot and listened. The story unfolded in fragments of broadcast journalism. Warren Finch arrested, embezzlement uncovered. Cyrus Maddox's confession, the staged robbery, the planted compass. Ray Harlan innocent of all charges. Ray sat motionless in the darkness, his back against a tree, as the truth washed over him. 3 months. 3 months of cold and hunger and fear, 3 months of living like an animal, 3 months of exile, all based on a lie. The emotions that surged through him were too complex for names, relief and rage and grief and vindication all tangled together. He thought of Warren Finch, a man he'd barely known, who'd chosen Ray as a convenient scapegoat. He thought of Cyrus Maddox, who'd stolen his compass, his life, his dignity. He thought of the town that had believed the worst of him so easily, so quickly. Through the trees, he saw Sheriff Walt Grimes standing by a command vehicle, his face haggard with exhaustion and guilt. Ray watched him for a long moment, this man who'd been his friend, who'd questioned him with doubt in his eyes, who now was leading the effort to find him. Ray could walk out right now, could step into the light and announce himself, could end this tonight. But something held him back. Fear, perhaps, or pride. Or the simple fact that he'd been so fundamentally changed by his months underground that the thought of returning to civilization felt almost as terrifying as staying hidden. He retreated into the forest, back to his shelter, and spent the night wrestling with the decision. By morning, he'd reached a resolution. He would reveal himself, but on his own terms. Not as someone caught or captured, but as someone choosing to return. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. Ray spent Friday preparing. He used precious water to wash himself in the freezing creek, scrubbing away months of grime. He trimmed his wild beard with his pocket knife, working carefully by feel. He found his wedding ring where he'd buried it in the tin at the bottom of his duffel, slipped it onto his finger where it belonged. He gathered the things that mattered: Claire's journal and photograph, the hand-carved spoon, the tin cup. Everything else could stay: the shelter, the tools, the remnants of his survival. Let them find it all later. Let them see what innocence looked like when driven underground. As afternoon faded toward evening, Ray climbed to a ridge he'd scouted weeks ago. From there, he could see Millbrook in the distance, its lights beginning to twinkle as dusk approached. 3 miles away, his home, his prison, his past, and now, perhaps, his future. He'd been saving dry wood for weeks, not knowing why, just following an instinct that someday he might need it. Now he understood. He built a signal fire carefully, professionally, a beacon that would be visible for miles. Ray stood beside the unlit wood as darkness settled fully over the forest. In his pocket he carried Claire's photograph. In his hands he held the matches that would announce his return. He thought of the man he'd been 3 months ago, soft, grief-worn, living a small life in a small town. That man was gone. The person who would walk out of these woods was someone different, forged by cold and hunger and absolute solitude. "I'm ready," Ray whispered to Claire's memory. "I'm ready to come back." He struck the match. The flame caught, grew, spread through the carefully stacked wood. Within minutes, the fire roared a column of light and heat visible across the valley. Ray stood beside it, waiting. Below, in the staging area, someone would see it. Radios would crackle. Vehicles would start. They would come. And Ray Harlan, innocent man, survivor, would finally emerge from the earth. The fire blazed against the night sky like a defiant star brought to earth. Ray stood beside it, his gaunt frame casting long shadows across the snow, and waited for the world to find him. The response was immediate. In the staging area below, someone shouted. Radios crackled to life. Headlights swept across the forest as vehicles roared into motion. Ray didn't move. He'd spent 3 months hiding, fleeing, burying himself in the earth. Now he stood in plain sight, outlined by flame, and felt something close to peace. The first vehicle arrived within 15 minutes, headlights stabbing up the old logging road. Sheriff Walt Grimes emerged from the patrol car, moving quickly but carefully, as if afraid the figure by the fire might vanish like smoke. "Ray." His voice carried across the distance, uncertain and hopeful. "Ray, is that you?" Ray turned toward the voice. His own voice, unused for so long except for whispered conversations with himself, came out rough and cracked. "Hello, Walt." Grimes broke. The professional mask he'd maintained through a week of searching shattered, and he stumbled forward, his face contorted with emotion. "God, Ray. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. We were wrong. We were all so wrong." Ray stood still as Walt approached, seeing the genuine anguish in his old friend's face. Part of him wanted to rage, to unleash 3 months of betrayal and fear. But standing here, with the fire warming his back and freedom so close he could taste it, rage felt like wasted energy. "I know," Ray said simply. "I heard. More vehicles arrived." Paramedics rushed forward with equipment, their professional urgency barely masking their shock at Ray's appearance. He'd lost so much weight that his clothes hung on him like he was a child playing dress-up. His face was gaunt, his beard wild, his eyes sunken but startlingly clear. "Sir, we need to check your vitals," a young paramedic said, approaching with a blood pressure cuff. Ray nodded, allowing them to work. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket, the silver fabric reflecting the firelight, and guided him to sit on the back of the ambulance. The blanket felt strange against his skin, too smooth, too clean, a reminder of the civilization he'd left behind. Blood pressure low, heart rate elevated but steady. Signs of malnutrition and dehydration, possible frostbite on his fingers and toes, but alive, remarkably, impossibly alive. Hugh Brennan arrived breathless, having hiked up from the road despite his 73 years. When he saw Ray, he collapsed to goad, his knees in the snow, his body racked with sobs. "Son," he gasped. "Dear God, son, I'm so sorry." Ray slid off the ambulance, knelt beside the old man, and put a hand on his shoulder. "Hugh, it's all right. I made it. I should have stood by you. I should have believed you. I let everyone. You're here now, Ray said quietly. That's what matters. A car screeched to a halt, and Gracie Holloway emerged carrying a large thermos. She pushed through the gathering crowd of searchers and officials, her face fierce with determination. Let me through. Let me through right now. She reached Ray and thrust the thermos at him with shaking hands. Chicken soup, homemade. You drink this. Ray accepted it, unscrewed the cap, and the smell nearly overwhelmed him. Real food, warm food, food he hadn't hunted or foraged or stolen from squirrels. He sipped carefully, and the warmth spread through his body like a benediction. His eyes watered from the heat or emotion he couldn't say. I never stopped believing, Gracie said, her voice breaking. I told everyone you didn't do it. I know you did. Ray managed a small smile. Thank you for that. The crowd at the base of the hill had grown. Word spread through the search teams, and people gathered to witness the moment the lost man found, the innocent man returned. The paramedics wanted to transport Ray to the hospital immediately, but he requested a moment. He stood at the fire, looking down at Millbrook in the distance, the town that had exiled him and now welcomed him back. Sheriff Grimes stood beside him, his face illuminated by the flames. Ray, I failed you. When you needed me most, I chose duty over friendship. I chose evidence over the man I'd known my whole life. Ray was quiet for a long moment. You did what you thought was right, Walt. The evidence pointed at me. I understand that. Understanding doesn't equal forgiveness. No, Ray agreed. But forgiveness has to start somewhere, doesn't it? We all failed each other. Maybe now we learn from it. Walt nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. Deputy Frank Cullen approached, the young man who'd never stopped questioning. Ray recognized him from town, though they'd never been close. Mr. Harlan, I'm Frank Cullen. I wanted you to know I kept looking. When everyone else stopped, I kept asking questions. Ray studied him. You're the one who found the inconsistencies? I had help. But yes, sir, something didn't sit right from the beginning. Then you have my thanks, Deputy. Real justice requires people willing to keep looking when it would be easier to stop. The fire had begun to die down. The paramedics grew more insistent about transport. Ray's body, having survived on adrenaline and determination, was beginning to crash. I need to go to the hospital, he said quietly. But there's something you should know. My shelter, where I've been living, it's about a quarter-mile northeast of here, beneath a large oak tree. You'll want to document it. Grimes nodded. We will. But Ray, how did you survive? 3 months in this cold? Ray thought of the answer, of everything those months had entailed, the hunger and fear and absolute loneliness. The nights when death seemed preferable to another day. The moments when only Claire's memory kept him breathing. One day at a time, he said finally. That's all any of us can do. They guided him into the ambulance. As the doors closed, Ray caught one last glimpse of the fire he'd built, the signal that had ended his exile. Tomorrow, he'd face the town, the questions, the aftermath. Tonight, he was simply a man heading toward warmth and safety. The ambulance began its careful descent down the mountain, carrying Ray Harlan back to the world of the living. Millbrook Community Hospital had never felt so crowded with purpose. Ray was admitted directly to a private room where Dr. Vernon Costas conducted a thorough examination. The doctor was in his 60s, a man who'd practiced in Millbrook for 30 years and knew most of his patients by name. Mr. Harlan, Dr. Costas said, reviewing the test results with evident amazement. You've lost approximately 40 pounds. You have early-stage frostbite on several fingers and toes. You're dehydrated and malnourished. Your vitamin D levels are critically low. And yet, he paused, shaking his head. You're remarkably healthy considering what you've endured. Your survival is nothing short of extraordinary. Ray lay in the hospital bed, the clean sheets feeling almost unbearably soft against his skin. "I had a good teacher," he said, touching the pocket where Claire's journal rested. The doctor nodded, understanding there was a story there he wouldn't press for. "We'll keep you for observation. Get fluids in you, start you on vitamin supplements, monitor for any complications. But barring anything unexpected, you should make a full physical recovery." Physical recovery. The qualifier hung in the air between them. That evening, Sheriff Grimes arrived with a full briefing. He sat in the chair beside Ray's bed and laid out everything that had happened. The bank audit that revealed Warren Finch's embezzlement. The burner phone discovered in his desk. Cyrus Maddox's confession detailing how he'd stolen the compass from Ray's truck weeks before the staged attack. "The compass," Ray said quietly. "I remember that day now. I was unloading supplies at the store. My truck was parked out front for maybe 20 minutes. Never even crossed my mind that someone would take something. Maddox said it was easy. He saw his opportunity and took it. They needed evidence to point at someone. And you," Grimes's voice caught, "you were convenient, a loner, no family to defend you. They thought you'd be easy to blame." Ray absorbed this, the casual cruelty of it. His entire life had been upended not because of who he was, but because of who he wasn't, because he had no wife to vouch for him. No children to rally around him, no close family to demand answers. Where are they now? Finch and Maddox? County jail. Finch is facing embezzlement charges, conspiracy, filing a false police report, and fraud. Maddox is charged with conspiracy and theft. They're both looking at significant prison time. Ray was quiet for a moment. "I want to see Warren." Grimes looked startled. "Why?" "Because I need to understand. I need to hear from him why he thought destroying my life was acceptable." The request was honored 2 days later. Ray was stronger then, able to walk without assistance, his body beginning to remember what it meant to be nourished. Sheriff Grimes arranged for Ray to be transported to the county jail under escort. Though the precaution seemed absurd, Ray was the victim, not the criminal. They brought Warren Finch to an interview room. He looked smaller than Ray remembered, diminished by orange jail clothing and the weight of his crimes. When he saw Ray gaunt, bearded, marked by months of survival, he couldn't meet his eyes. Ray sat across from him, separated by a table but connected by the terrible intimacy of what Warren had done. "Look at me," Ray said quietly. Warren forced his gaze up. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. "Why?" Ray asked. "Just tell me why." Warren's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I was drowning. The gambling debts, the money I'd taken, I couldn't see a way out. When the audit was announced, I panicked. I needed someone to blame. And you." He stopped, swallowed. "You were alone. I thought it would be easy. I thought you'd just get arrested, maybe do a few years. You didn't think I was a person," Ray finished. "You didn't think about what it would mean to take everything from someone." "I'm sorry." Warren's face crumpled. "God, Ray, I'm so sorry. What I did to you, there's no excuse. No justification. I destroyed your life to save mine, and I have to live with that." Ray studied him, this broken man who'd caused so much pain. He felt anger, certainly, but beneath it was something else, a kind of weary understanding of how fear drives people to terrible choices. "I forgive you, Warren," Ray said. Warren's head jerked up, disbelief on his face. "What? I forgive you? Not because you deserve it, not because what you did is somehow acceptable, but because carrying hate forward into whatever comes next would dishonor what I survived. I lived 3 months in the ground, alone in the dark, fighting for every breath. I'm not going to poison that survival with bitterness." Tears streamed down Warren's face. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "No," Ray agreed. "You don't. But I'm not giving it for you, I'm giving it for me." The meeting ended shortly after. Ray was driven back to the hospital, feeling lighter somehow. as if naming the forgiveness had released a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. Over the next week, Ray began the slow process of reintegration. Brennan visited daily, bringing updates from the hardware store and shy offers to make Ray a full partner. Gracie Holloway arrived with home-cooked meals, ignoring the nurses' protests about hospital dietary restrictions. Other townspeople came too, some with apologies, some with simple gratitude that he'd survived. Ray received them all with quiet grace, neither absolving the town of its collective guilt nor condemning them for their failure. They'd been human, fallible, frightened, just as he was. On his 8th day in the hospital, Ray asked to be taken back to the shelter. A small team accompanied him: Sheriff Grimes, Deputy Cullen, and a Forest Service agent named Patricia Mills, who specialized in historical preservation. They hiked through the forest. Ray had called home, following his directions. When they reached the ancient oak, Ray stood for a moment, with his hand on its massive trunk. "Thank you, old friend," he whispered. They descended into the shelter, and the officials stood in awed silence. The space was remarkably sophisticated: reinforced walls, ventilation system, carefully organized supplies, evidence of months of solitary existence etched into every surface. "This needs to be preserved," Patricia Mills said softly. "This is a testament to human resilience, to survival against impossible odds." Ray nodded. He retrieved the carved spoon and the dented tin cup, his only keepsakes from this chapter of his life. Everything else could stay, could become part of whatever story people told about the man who lived beneath the earth. As they climbed back to the surface, Ray took one final look at the space that had saved him and nearly killed him. Then he turned his back on it and walked toward the light. 2 weeks after his rescue, Millbrook held a ceremony in Ray's honor. The town hall was packed beyond capacity, residents spilling out into the hallway and onto the front steps. Ray sat in the front row wearing clothes. Hugh had bought him his old wardrobe, no longer fit his transformed body, and tried to reconcile this moment with the memory of his last night underground. Mayor Patricia Hollenbeck, Gracie's younger sister, stood at the podium with tears in her eyes. "We gather today not in celebration, but in recognition and apology. Ray Harlan, this town failed you in the most fundamental way. We allowed fear to override truth, suspicion to replace trust. We turned our backs when you needed us most." Ray shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd asked them not to do this, but the town needed it, needed some public act of contrition, some way to process their collective shame. The mayor continued, "On behalf of Millbrook, I offer our deepest apologies, and we present you with this." She held up a compass, new and gleaming. The inscription reads, "To Ray Harlan, true north," because that's what you are, sir. A man who never lost his moral direction, even when the rest of us lost ours. Ray accepted the compass with a nod of thanks, his throat too tight for words. The room erupted in applause that felt both sincere and inadequate. What applause could compensate for 3 months of exile? Later, he stood outside the town hall while people approached one by one. Some offered apologies, some simply squeezed his hand, some wept openly. Ray received them all with the same quiet dignity, neither demanding nor rejecting their remorse. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought him a plate of cookies. "I crossed the street to avoid you," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so ashamed." "You were scared," Ray said gently. "People do things they regret when they're scared." The criminal trials proceeded swiftly. Warren Finch pleaded guilty to all charges and received 15 years. Cyrus Maddox, who'd cooperated fully with investigators, received 8 years. Ray attended both sentencings but declined to make victim impact statements. His presence was statement enough. As spring arrived, Ray returned to work at Brennan's Hardware. Hugh had indeed made him a full partner, insisting it should have happened years ago. The customers were awkward at first, overly solicitous, asking tentative questions about his ordeal. Ray deflected most inquiries with gentle humor, preferring to talk about paint colors and proper drill bits. But he'd changed in ways that couldn't be hidden. He moved differently now, more deliberately, more quietly, with the economy of motion learned in survival. His eyes held something deeper, harder, a quality of having looked into darkness and emerged intact but altered. He'd started writing in the evenings, not for publication but for processing. Using Claire's journal as inspiration, he filled pages with reflections on survival, forgiveness, justice, and the nature of truth. The writing helped him make sense of what had happened, helped him transform trauma into something he could carry forward. Sheriff Grimes visited Ray's house one Sunday evening, arriving unannounced with a six-pack of beer and a burden of unfinished business. They sat on Ray's small porch, drinking in comfortable silence until Walt finally spoke. "I keep thinking about what you said, about us all failing each other, and I want you to know I've changed how we handle investigations, new protocols, more scrutiny of evidence, better protection for the accused." Ray nodded. "That's good, Walt. That matters. Does it make up for what happened to you?" "Nothing makes up for it, but using it to prevent future failures that gives it meaning, that's probably the best any of us can hope for." They talked until dark, rebuilding their friendship carefully, acknowledging that it would never be quite what it was before, but accepting that what they were building now had its own value. 6 months after his rescue, Ray hiked back to the ancient oak. The Forest Service had preserved his shelter, installed a small historical marker, and occasionally guided tours for students and visitors interested in survival stories. Ray had given his permission for this, understanding that his experience could teach others about resilience and the importance of seeking truth. He stood beside the oak tree as the summer sun filtered through new leaves. The forest had recovered from winter, green and alive and indifferent to human drama. Ray placed his hand on the rough bark, feeling the solid presence of something that had stood here long before his crisis and would stand long after. "I found my way back," he whispered, thinking of Claire. "Not to who I was, but to who I needed to become." He pulled out both compasses, the old one recovered as evidence, and returned to him, and the new one from the town. He held them together, past and future, loss and recovery. A hiker appeared on the trail, a young woman with a backpack. She stopped when she saw Ray, recognition dawning on her face. You're Ray Harlan, aren't you? The man who lived underground?" Ray smiled slightly. "I'm Ray Harlan, who lived underground once, yes. That must have been terrifying." "It was," Ray agreed. "But it also taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way. About strength, about forgiveness, about what matters when everything else is stripped away." The hiker nodded thoughtfully and continued on her way. Ray watched her disappear into the trees, then began his own walk back to town. Millbrook appeared in the distance, the same small town it had always been, but seen now through different eyes. Ray had learned that communities were fragile things, built on trust that could shatter overnight. But he'd also learned they could heal, could grow, could become better through the painful work of acknowledgement and change. He walked down Main Street as evening settled, past Gracie's diner where his usual table waited, past the hardware store that now bore his name on the sign alongside Hugh's, past the Methodist church where he still sat in the fourth pew. People waved. He waved back. Simple gestures that once would have been automatic but now carried weight recognition that connection was precious, that community was both obligation and gift. Ray reached his house on Maple Street and stood for a moment on the porch, key in hand. The house was no longer empty the way it had been. He'd filled it with his writing, with new routines, with the quiet satisfaction of having survived and chosen to keep living. He thought of a line he'd written the night before. "They say hardship reveals character. I learned it creates it. In the dark, beneath the earth, I discovered what I was made of. Not guilt or innocence, but simply this, the will to persist, the grace to forgive, and the courage to begin again." Ray unlocked his door and stepped inside, leaving the compasses on the small table by the entrance reminders of where he'd been and who he'd become. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and choices. But tonight, Ray Harlan was simply home, alive, and ready for whatever came. Next, the truth had set him free. Now, he had to figure out what to do with that freedom.